Hello and welcome to the second episode of On the Fringe, the series where we take a look at tournament lists that didn't quite finish in the top 4, but brought something very interesting to the table and finished within the top half of the tournament. And today we're going to be looking at two lists, one from the Forces of Death Guard and the other from the Forces of the Sisters of Battle, also known as the Adepta Sororitas. At the end of this video, let me know which list you found more interesting, as both these lists have something in common that you'll notice very quickly after you see what these lists contain within them. With that being said, let's begin by taking a look at our Death Guard list. This Death Guard list was played by a player known as Don Husan, played in the Ocotillo Onslaught event, and it placed 12th out of 33 players. And to begin with, this list begins with an Outrider detachment being composed of the Inexorable Plague Company. And as detachments normally do, it begins with an HQ choice, in this case being a Chaos Sorcerer in Terminator armor. This Chaos Sorcerer ends up being the Warlord of this army, being armed with a Combi Melta, a Force Axe, and the Sorcerer has two psychic powers, the first one being the Curse of the Leper, which allows him to generate quite a few mortal wounds against squishier targets. And the second one being the Gift of Plagues, which is another rather popular psychic power that allows him to extend the range of the contagion abilities by 6 inches when cast on a unit. And being the Warlord, he has both a Warlord trait and a relic. The Warlord trait being the special contagion from the Inexorable Plague Company known as Ferric Blight, which helps the armor penetration of friendly units when targeting enemies afflicted by this contagion. This can really help a shooting army especially, and it'll be interesting to see how this contagion is utilized within this list. For relics, he's given the rather popular relic known as the Plague Skull of Glothilla, and this relic helps generate a few mortal wounds. As we've seen with many 9th edition lists, mortal wounds are a very popular option when looking at different HQ choices, and it seems like the Death Guard are no exception in this situation. However, we'll come back to his Terminator Sorcerer as he brings a little more to the table in this army specifically. Now, as this is an Outrider detachment, it does not include any troop choices and goes right to elite choices. That elite choice being 2 units of 10 Death Guard Possessed. And the Death Guard Possessed are a rather powerful melee unit that actually sees some reasonable amount of play, and it's one that I think is a bit overlooked. However, I definitely generally prefer the Death Shroud Terminators over the Possessed in terms of the first elite choice, but I can definitely see the justification for Possessed, especially if you have multiple Chaos armies and use these Possessed within different Chaos armies. And as we continue looking at this list, the reasons for why you might not have Death Shroud Terminators will become more apparent as well. As usually, it's kind of strange to see a Death Guard player not having any Death Shroud Terminators. Now, being an Outrider detachment, it's going to be filled with quite a few different fast attack choices. The first 2 fast attack choices in this case are 2 Bloat Drones with heavy blight launchers. And this is actually kind of an interesting inclusion because normally you see the folded Bloat Drone coming armed with the Flesh Mower over the other options. However, in some occasions, you do see the blight launcher as an option itself, and considering we already have those possessed, it might make sense to bring a little more firepower as opposed to going more melee heavy, considering you kind of already have that fulfilled. And let's continue looking on the list, as once again this is one of those choices that becomes a little more interesting as we have better context of what else is included. And the next 3 choices within this list are all fast attack choices, being 3 units of 2 Mephitic Blight Haulers each. And the Mephitic Blight Hauler has been seeing more and more play within the meta as time has progressed. This unit is still probably a tiny bit overpriced, but it does bring a rather powerful multi-melta and some rockets to the table on a very powerful and durable body. As such, it's a rather interesting unit and a rather cheap model to buy in terms of dollar cost, so it's one that's rather popular and one that looks rather amazing, so I don't fault anyone for playing it, and I can definitely see the justification for doing so in such an elite list that's elite by even Death Guard standards, considering you're pretty much playing a bunch of fast attack heavy vehicles as opposed to any kind of Poxwalkers or other such units that give you a much bigger model count within normal Death Guard lists. And finally, this list ends with 1 heavy support choice, being the very powerful Plague Burst Crawler, armed with 2 Entropy Cannons and a Heavy Slugger, which is a pretty normal armament for this monster of a vehicle. And that's all this list includes, so as you can see, it has brought a lot of vehicles to the table with very heavy firepower. Now let's talk about some of those things that I mentioned along the way that might make you think a little bit more about what this list does. The first thing I mentioned was that it was kind of interesting that it did not include any Death Shroud Terminators, and that it might be an indication that this player is not actually a Death Guard player, but rather a Chaos player. Why do I think that? Well, the simple answer is things like the Bloat Drone, Blight Haulers, and Plague Burst Crawler oftentimes see play within other Chaos factions as an allied faction, and not a primary Death Guard force because they don't really need the contagions in order to function, and the Possessed and Sorcerer are definitely playable outside of the Death Guard forces, and that's probably why we don't see things like the Death Shroud, Poxwalkers, or even Malignant Plaguecaster as we would see from a dedicated Death Guard player. However, this does not mean this is simply a player who allies Death Guard forces, as there could be other justifications for the choices being made. One such reason might be that the reason the Malignant Plaguecaster was included and a Sorcerer in Terminator armor is because the Terminator Sorcerer can deep strike into the game using Teleportation Strike and position better to utilize his different psychic powers, or even his special contagion that he carries, as well as the relic that he's armed with. So there might be general justification for why this is the HQ choice made within this list, as opposed to the previous justification I mentioned. Though that being said, this is a very shooty army for what Death Guard normally bring to the table, and that definitely makes this an interesting list. The one other thing I really want to point out is this list is actually 1,890 points and not 2,000 points, meaning that you have another 110 points to play with, so that would have been a very easy include of Poxwalkers if they were available. That, or maybe Death Shroud Terminators if you dropped a couple Possessed, and the Death Shroud Terminators would give you more ability to teleport strike onto a table and hold objectives. Both those things would have really helped with some of the issues that this list might have, such as having a very low unit count and a lacking of objectives secured, meaning that it will have a very hard time fighting for objectives, even though it can easily sit on those objectives and can put out a ton of damage with a lot of range firepower, as well as very powerful melee threats with those possessed. In either case, I would have really liked to know why the player made the choices that he did and what led him to bring such a unique Death Guard list, as well as if he had other Chaos forces to ally with, and I would like to know why this player decided to forgo 110 points to bring specifically a Death Guard force. Was it for that Ferric Blight Contagion and the general contagions that Death Guard have, as this list does have a decent amount of mobility with those two Bloat Drones and the Terminator Sorcerer with his Teleportation Strike, as well as the Mephitic Blight Haulers not being a particularly slow unit, thus allowing their heavy firepower to do even more than it would normally do in most situations. And at the end of the day, even though it could be made a little bit more refined, I do think it's a very impressive list that brings a very vehicle-centric army of the Death Guard to a table that can perform rather well. I have seen other iterations of a similar idea played in tournaments, so it does show that this isn't kind of a one-off thing that was only successful because of a fluke, but rather one that kind of shows up across time. However, this one is the one that went the deepest with the specific theme of the list, so that's why I chose it over other options that went very heavy into the fast attack and heavy support, but brought additional units that filled out a more generic role within the Death Guard forces. But what about you? What do you think about this kind of list? Does it appeal to you, or do you prefer a more infantry-heavy style list? The second list we're going to look at today is the Sisters of Battle list that was played by Johnny K. Jankowski in the Fantasia Fanatic XL event. In either case, this Sisters of Battle list placed 13th out of 50 players, and no, the theme of these lists isn't that they placed within the 12th and 13th place in consecutive order in different events. So let's take a look at what's potentially a very unique Sisters of Battle list. This list begins with a Spearhead detachment being drawn from the Militant Order of the Valorous Heart. And the HQ choice for this detachment is a single missionary, being armed with an autogun and a chainsword, as well as bringing the hymn of the Course of Spiritual Fortitude. Normally, I'm not too keen on this war hymn, but in this list, I think it's very fitting, and it'll be very apparent very quickly. And being a Spearhead detachment, this list once again skips the troop choice and goes right to the elite choice, bringing two elite choices consisting of 2 units of 2 Crusaders. The Crusaders are low cost and tanky objective holders that fulfill the role very well within the 9th edition codex, and as such have been rather popular, even overtaking the Death Cult Assassins for that position within different army lists, and in this army they serve that exact function. After the 2 elite choices comes 2 fast attack choices, being 2 units of 5 Seraphims, and once again these are more of an objective holder than an offensive unit, considering they're not armed with any special weapons and have a lot of mobility, as well as the ability to deep strike without having to be taken into strategic reserves like the Crusaders do if you wish to deploy them within the reserved phase. Though once again, they're a low costing unit that has a very easy time showing up on the battlefield and performing actions, taking objectives, or completing secondaries of various form. Now, so far all we've seen are different objective capturing units, as well as a very low cost HQ choice in a Spearhead detachment. We also know that there's a shared theme between these 2 different lists. So what do you think is coming up next within this list, considering we're moving on to the heavy support choices? And if you guessed Mortifiers, well then you'd be correct. Mortifiers being one of my favorite units, this list brings 3 units of 4 Mortifiers, and each of those units containing an Anchorite upgrade to give them a little bit more durability. And in 9th edition, even though the Mortifiers lost a little bit of power, they're still an absolute beast of a unit that has a reasonable enough shooting profile, as well as an incredibly vicious melee profile on a reasonably durable body for an incredibly low cost. though we'll mention when I looked up this list, it did not specify the weapons that the mortifiers were armed with, so I can only assume that they're armed with heavy bolters and penitent flails, though that's all an assumption considering I don't know what they're actually armed with, so do take that with a grain of salt. Now this list doesn't end there, and it actually takes 3 more heavy support choices. What are those heavy support choices? Well, they're the next best thing to mortifiers, being 3 units of 4 penitent engines, and in this case, I'm going to once again assume that they're armed with penitent flails, although the buzz blades could definitely be a very real choice when arming different things like the penitent engines and the mortifiers. I do think the penitent flails do take a little bit of a priority over the buzz blades, however that's something that you just have to make as a choice for yourself, as both can be a valid option. And in the 9th edition codex, the penitent engines have definitely gotten better, though even in the past, a lot of times the penitent engines did see play alongside the mortifiers in lists like this, but up until now, I don't believe we've seen lists like this within the 9th edition meta, so it's nice to see that this is an available tactic that can be brought to the table. And I want to make a quick note here about that missionary who brings the Chorus of Spiritual Fortitude, as it can target engines of redemption, thus allowing it to benefit the mortifiers or penitent engines with a nice buff by allowing them to ignore psychic powers, and thus giving them a little more resilience against certain types of armies. In addition to that, the missionary is the lowest costing HQ choice, which makes him a decent include for a list that's trying to maximize on a certain type of unit. And while I don't normally like super spammy lists, it's definitely cool to see a large army of mortifiers and penitent engines running across the battlefield and causing havoc, as I do make an exception for such awesome looking models when taken within army lists such as this. However, unlike the first army we looked at, this one does include a second detachment, being a patrol detachment of the Order of the Valorous Heart. And this detachment includes a single HQ choice, being a Canoness, that is the warlord of this army, and she has the upgrade of the Blessed Blade and an Inferno Pistol. In addition to that, she has the warlord trait being impervious to pain, and the relic known as the Iron Surplus of Saint Estella. Both these items do contribute to her survivability in an immense way, so she's much more of a durability Canoness than an offensive Canoness, as we discussed within the Canoness and Palatine video for the Sisters of Battle. And moving on from the HQ choice, as this is a patrol detachment, this detachment does require you to take at least 1 troop choice. In this case, this list has taken 1 unit of 5 Sisters of Battle, being the only troop within these 2 lists, and that's just one of those differences that we see from other normal lists that are normally rather troop heavy. There is 1 more fast attack choice within this patrol detachment, being a unit of 5 more Seraphim, and in this case the superior is armed with a plasma pistol. Most likely this was just a way of eating up some extra points, as they didn't have other options that they wish to include in the list, and that's why we see it on this unit but not the other 2 units. And finally, there is yet 1 more heavy support choice, which is an Exorcist tank armed with a 100 killer missile, and unfortunately it does not tell me what the weapon choices of the Exorcist tank is, but based on the points cost, I can deduce it's the heavier of the 2 options, as the points would be different otherwise. And if all those mortifiers and penitent engines are armed with flails, this list shouldn't have any issues dealing with smaller units, considering how much damage those melee weapons can put out. And that's everything that's included within this list. As you can see, there's a lot of durability options included, such as the Crusaders and the Seraphims, which are very mobile and can deep strike into battle without requiring you to spend command points, and both HQ choices do contribute to that durability, with the Canoness being very durability focused with her warlord trait and relic, as well as the missionary having a war hymn that allows him to give some durability to those mortifiers and penitent engines, as long as he can be in range of them. And even though her militant choice is the Valorous Heart, which further contributes to the general durability. And as a whole, it's good to see that such elite lists can still see play within 9th edition for both the Death Guard and the Sisters of Battle. So which of these lists did you find the most interesting, as I think both are rather impressive, and do you prefer more elite style lists filled with different monstrous units, such as these 2 lists, or do you prefer a more infantry style play, or what kind of type of army do you enjoy playing? Let me know in the comments down below, as I'm interested to hear, because it's always interesting to hear what others enjoy playing on the tabletop. And as always, if you've enjoyed the content, like and subscribe, as it really does help the channel out. And if you get the opportunity, please do share the channel, as that not only massively helps the channel, but also helps the people who may discover it and benefit from the content. I would also like to give a quick shout out to my patrons. You guys are awesome people. Thank you very much for supporting the channel. And regardless if you're a patron or not, thank you for watching and have a great day.